and go into my other one.
Okay.
Yeah, just
no
text
worries.
me if you need anything.
I'll send you a Skype if I need you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Bye.
Ah, yes. That's true.
Not that hard. I think we should on doing it. What's your hand up to that one?
Dengerin webinar gitu.
play it on the other one listening in.
Okay.
So if you want to have it loud.
Well, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. My name is Alison Lord, and I will be taking you through this session today on internal auditing to be conducted remotely. If I could just, I'll go through some housekeeping. If you could keep your line muted, I will occasionally go in and mute all, but it's very easy to get background noise coming through. So if you can keep your line on mute, you should be able to do that next to your name. There'll be a little microphone symbol that you can mute your name there. If you need to ask a question as we go through, it's probably best to type that into the chat box and to all participants so we can all see the question. And I will go through any questions at the end of the session. And you can also, if you want to raise your hand, there's a little hand symbol that you can do that if you want to specifically ask a question, and I can unmute you to ask the question as well. I'll just occasionally have to keep muting everyone as people come through. The session should go for about 45 minutes. Today, and allow time for questions at the end. And I'll just go through, right, so can I just have someone type in the chat box that you can actually hear what I'm saying, because Mitchell is saying that he can't hear anything. Can I confirm that people can hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can. Good, good. Okay. So Mitchell probably needs to get some audio working there. Okay, thank you for the people that said you can hear. That's great. Okay, so just to give you a quick little background as to who's behind the microphone. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. I'm the General Manager for Technical and Operations. Lisa Aspinall, who was going to run this session, has unfortunately injured her back and has had to have some surgery, which is not good for her. So I've just jumped in to fill in for her to cover the information that we have for the remote auditing. So more than happy to answer any questions that you have around how you can maintain your internal audit program during these COVID-19 conditions, but also to give you some ideas of how you can maybe look at your internal audit program in a different way now, which I think everybody's now started to look at how we can do work in a different way. We've seen that we can actually do things remotely quite well, and this may give you an opportunity to actually maybe rejig your internal audit program, not just to get through these current times, but for future, as to how you can maybe do a mix of face-to-face and remote auditing at the same time. So I'll go onto the slides, and I'm glad people can hear there. Okay, go onto the slides, and I'll just take you through some of the information, and then, as I said, more than happy for you to ask any questions at the end. There's a couple of people I can hear in the background that I can't mute them. If you could please mute your audio. There we go, I can do it now. That would be good. Okay, so the main purpose of this session is it's not to teach you how to do auditing. We're assuming that you all know how to do audits. This is more how can you apply your current skills in auditing to conduct them remotely, and to pick up on where are the opportunities that you can do it remotely, where are the risks that it will not necessarily work as a remote audit. So particularly, I can hear people have got their line there. So as you've no doubt experienced over the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of operations have changed within the business, and internal audits will be one of the many things that have probably been put to the back burner, because most of us don't like having to do them anyway, but it is something that you still need to do to maintain your certification. So what we'll take you through is how can you actually keep up your internal audit program while you're under these sort of unusual working conditions, because you still need to check that your system is being maintained. If you have an audit scheduled anytime this year, that will be one of the questions that will be asked, is how have you actually maintained your system? How are you ensuring that even under COVID-19 conditions, your people are still following the processes? And if you've had to change your processes to accommodate changes in the work environment, how have you done that under your management system? What have you changed? What have you monitored to check that it's actually been implemented effectively? And your internal audit program is going to be used for that. So if you do have change procedures where people are working from home, there's different risks to the business. Obviously, you've got different health and safety risks with people working from home than being in office. How are you actually monitoring that? How are you doing your audits in a way that you can still get that confidence that your management system is still being maintained? So certainly if you are having an audit between now and the end of the year, you will need to be prepared to be asked whether or not you'll be asked whether or not you've been doing your internal audits. I'm just trying to see, Mitchell probably needs to change his sound to the phone. Let me just type here that Mitchell, use your phone. Yeah, so you'll be asked all the sorts of things, and these are the things that certainly, whether you're a BSI client or not, you will be asked to say, are you still doing your internal audits? Are you maintaining your corrective action management reviews? All those sorts of things. So this will give you an opportunity to think, okay, maybe if we haven't been doing our internal audits over the last few months, maybe we can get a few remote audits in before our external audit to show that we are actually still monitoring our process as well. So we'll look at why remote auditing is an option, and it is actually, it's always been allowed. It's covered in 19,011, which is the guidance document, and that was updated recently to put more information in there about remote auditing. But remote auditing has always been something that we can do, but it's never been one that is probably the first choice for doing an audit. I think the face-to-face, the ability to observe activities and so on is still very important. But there are plenty of audits where basically just doing it as a desktop or doing it over a webinar is more than adequate. So we'll look at those sort of ones. Where are the risks of doing an audit that way, that it may or may not work, but then what are the opportunities, which ones can work in doing it remotely without having to actually physically be on site. And we'll look at the different types of technology that you can use to do those audits. Someone hasn't muted their line. If you could please mute your audio. I can't mute you. And then we'll look at, in terms of planning, conducting and reporting on the audits. If you are doing it remotely, there are some different guidelines as to how you should do that. Again, as an internal audit program, it's probably not as critical. Those sort of guidelines are more for when we do remote audits as a certification body or doing external audits. That will be more important for us, but we'll go through what the requirements are for that. Okay, so remote auditing. The definition of it in itself is that you're physically not on site with the person that you're auditing. Now, you may be at your workplace and auditing somebody at another workplace in another part of the city or in another state or even overseas. That would be considered a remote audit. Even if you're still in your workplace, it's still considered to be a remote audit. It just means you're not physically at the same place that the auditee is at. The different types of remote audits under 19,011 is you can have it with human interaction. So you're going through, sorry, somebody has unmuted themselves. So you might be via webinar, perhaps conducting interviews over the phone. You could be watching somebody performing work using a camera. You could be sharing screens where you're looking at records and documents on a screen. Those sort of things are all remote audits involving human interaction. But then we can also do remote audits where we're just looking at it, doing a desktop type review. We're looking at records, we're looking at procedures. We're not necessarily talking to anyone face to face at the time. We might go through all the documentation and then have a closing meeting with them afterwards and go through the findings as well. And in fact, most remote audits will usually be a combination of both. You'll have some sort of interaction to start with. You might have an interview with a couple of people. You might look at some activities if you can, and then they might send you some documents online, or you might be able to share them in a Dropbox or something like that, and you can then have a look at the documentation, read through it all, and then come back and discuss it. Question from Crystal there, what is the difference between remote auditing and a virtual audit? Technically, not much difference. What we're finding with some virtual audits, and again, I think some people probably use the words interchangeably, but we've got some clients that are virtual, provide virtual activities. So we've got one client, for example, that they do analysis of x-rays and that sort of thing, purely virtually. They're all, the doctors are sitting in their own home. They get the material electronically, and then they go through and look at it, and then they will send the report back and so on. They don't talk to anyone. Everything's done via a complete virtual workplace, so they don't have an office. We don't have anywhere that we can actually physically go and audit them. They are all dispersed. So that's what we would call a virtual workplace. Doing an audit of them is going to be done remotely because there's nowhere that we can actually sit with them. Sorry, somebody's unmuted there. If you could please mute your line. So to answer your question there, Crystal, it's probably, from that perspective, the same sort of thing. Any time that you are not physically in the same place as the auditee, then that would be considered a remote audit. And if the business is delivering their services remotely or through virtual interface, then that's all going to be done as a remote audit. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm glad you can hear now, Mitchell. Welcome. So some of the risks, though, that we do need to consider, and it's always something that you need to look at, and particularly if you're going through and perhaps reviewing your whole internal audit program after we've now had these changed work conditions, and you think, you know, I've got more opportunity where I could actually do remote auditing now. Think about the risks. There will be some activities that may or may not be able to be audited remotely. And there may be some schemes, if you're certified to a particular scheme, that may not allow remote audits as well. Most of your ISO type schemes, your 9000 for quality, 14 for environment, 45 or 4801 for safety, even asset management and information security, all those sort of ones, they will generally allow a number of remote audits to be done for your internal auditing. Some of the food schemes, however, and I'm not sure what the background of the people that are in the call, but some of the food schemes don't allow remote auditing. They need for you to, if you're doing HACCP or something like that, you need to physically be on site to see how those activities are taking place. So you need to first of all check, is there any restrictions within the scheme that I'm certified that might prohibit any remote auditing. There will certainly be some circumstances where you won't be able to witness activities of someone taking a mobile phone, for example, on site to watch somebody, maybe filming somebody performing activity and the other person at the other end is watching it on the screen. If there's sterile environments or something like that where you can't take any devices in, or if you're going to be fancy and have Google glasses and things like that, you may not be able to take that stuff in. So again, consider the work environment. If it's a really noisy environment, it may not be suitable to then be filming things, or you may just have to, you might be on site filming and then just watch what's happening and then wait till you get out of the noisy environment and then have the interview and talk about what you've just seen as well. So there might be ways around areas where there's risks like that. Some information may not be accessible. You may find that, you can't access the systems that the other site has, and so you might not be able to share screens or get into their database. And so you might need to then, look at other options of emailing information or having a Dropbox or something like that. But then you have to consider what are the security risks of the information that I'm sending over the internet as well. And then obviously, connectivity issues that we've had some clients that, they just don't have access to the equipment to be able to do a remote audit. They might not have decent internet speed to be able to have a webinar where they can have audio and video on there. It may just be easier to go back to the old telephone and email, which we've had for some of our clients as well, where you clearly you just go back to interviewing over the phone and then having a look at some records over email. So you can go right up to the really fancy Google glasses and having that sort of IT down to very, very basic. Let's just have a chat over the phone, if that helps. It all depends on whether you want to actually observe activities, and that's where it comes down to the risk. What's the risk that I won't see everything that's happening on that site if I do it remotely? And for things like health and safety and environment, they're the ones where we would probably want to do them on site. But if there's some things that we perhaps might be able to cover part of it remotely and part of it on site, then we'll do a bit of a mix between the two. The opportunities are certainly there. Places that maybe, some of you may have sites that are physically remote out in regional parts of the state, and so they don't get visited as often for internal audits because of their location. If you're able to do that remotely, then it brings that site back into the fold, gives them a bit more opportunity to be examined, maybe makes them feel part of it. I've certainly found myself having meetings rather than over the phone, having more of the webinars where we're all face-to-face in my team has certainly been an advantage, that it brings everybody together and feels like they're all part of the team because they're now involved in the meetings on the camera. So there might be the ability to actually still do part of the audit remotely, even if it's just looking at the documentation and interviewing people, and then you may have to examine activities and so on at a later date if you don't think that you can achieve your audit objectives by using video or photographs or whatever it might be. If the organisation has a centralised management system and they're all online and you can access everything online and all the records and so on online, then there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't do that sort of audit remotely as well. Naturally, there's no travel associated with it, which is great. Certainly saves a bit of cost in doing that. And obviously you can focus your audit on particular activities in more detail. You can look at the overall plan and make sure that you're covering everything that you need to. So these are just some of the examples. I've already talked about some of the ways that you can do remote audits, so you can all have access to the same network and looking at, as I said, the documents and records and so on in your own management system. You can have teleconferences. At BSI, we've actually now had 3 external audits with JASANs done remotely since March, because we get audited just about every 2 or 3 months. For different schemes, and I must say I've actually enjoyed it more than having the JASAN's auditors on site. So we've had, in one audit, we had 2 people in Melbourne, 1 person in Auckland, 1 person in Christchurch, and 3 of us in Sydney, and we were all dialing in. And we all managed to then set up different sessions where we went into for different groups and shared screens, went through all the records. Anything that in addition they needed, I just emailed to them, and it actually worked really, really well. And it was, I think, much better use of time than having people on site, and certainly saved in terms of travel costs and so on. But again, it's not going to be the only way of doing auditing, but it certainly worked very, very well. So you can share documents, you can take photographs of different things and send it to people. You can have, as I said, telephone interviews. People might be able to use FaceTime or Google Hangouts or Skype and take a phone around to video activities. And then you can share screens as well. Look, you're really only limited by your imagination as to what technology is available to you as to how you can actually do these particular audits. This is just some of the other things to look at there. So, as I mentioned, WebEx, social media, smart glasses, those sorts of things. Probably the most common one that is being used at the moment is Skype and WebEx. Zoom has been very popular. I think the shareholders of Zoom are very pleased with themselves. It's just skyrocketed. There obviously you need to consider security and so on. And if it's internal, it's not so much of a risk as what we have with external audits. So we will normally choose the platform that our client wants us to choose because of their security, and they will send us invitations on their WebEx account or Skype or Zoom, whatever it might be, rather than the auditor's account, because again, it gives them that control over that. If you're doing internal audits, it should all be within the one organisation, so you've got your own internal system. It might be just as easy to use Skype calls, and you can share screens that way as well and navigate around different parts of your application. So really, it's whatever works for you and the auditee. So you need to make sure both people are comfortable with it, because obviously we all know as auditors that people get very nervous during an audit, whether it's an internal or an external audit. So adding then this remote application of technology can potentially add a higher stress level to people if they're getting audited and they're not comfortable with the technology. So make sure they're comfortable. We'll talk about some planning things that you need to take into account, but keep that in mind, that having a different way of running the audit can actually make people a little bit more nervous as well. But whatever options are available to you, and you have to consider the internal security in there as well. You don't want to be, Zoom bombed, as people are talking about now, with Hamish going in there and bombing people's meetings. So unless you might find that more exciting and more interesting, it might make the audit more enjoyable for everybody, but you need to consider the security internally there. So think about what it is you're trying to achieve by the audit. So every audit has to have an objective, a scope and a criteria. So the objective is why we're doing the audit. Is it a regular scheduled audit, or is it one that we're doing as a one-off to check a changed procedure or investigating a complaint or whatever it might be? The scope is the boundaries of the audit. So what am I auditing, what am I not auditing? And there might be some things that you can only audit part of the scope remotely, and the other part of it might have to be postponed until you can go on site and do the rest of that particular audit. So it might be that you have to look at your audit schedule and say, look, I've got these audits that were planned for the next 6 months. I can probably do 20, 30, 40% of them remotely, and then I'm going to have to postpone the others until we can actually physically go on site, particularly if it's interstate and we've still got state boundaries, closed, borders closed and that sort of stuff. So look at the scope of the audit. Can I cover it all remotely? If yes, then that's okay. If I can't, maybe I can do part of it remotely and part of it on site later on. The audit criteria is, what am I auditing against? Is it my internal procedure? Is it a customer contract? Is it a standard itself? Is it a regulatory requirement that I'm auditing against? And check that that criteria can actually be audited remotely as well. Am I going to be able to see sufficient evidence if I do it remotely to cover the entire criteria of that audit? Consider the location. So again, if it's able to go on site and you can do that, that's fine. If it's obviously in a remote location, it might lend itself towards doing the remote audits. Can I evaluate all the activities? So as I mentioned before, what are the risks of not seeing all the things that I need to see? Think about the duration. This is something that we've certainly noticed with the remote audits that we've been doing, is that while you might have scheduled a 3-hour audit face-to-face, traditionally, remotely, it might be very different. And you may not be able to do 3 hours face-to-face, but it might still take 3 hours, but you might have a lot more preparation time up front to be able to work out what is it I want to look at, how am I going to get this information, have the face-to-face for maybe part of that, and then some time without human interaction, looking at records and reviewing the findings, and then come back on again and have another meeting for a closing meeting. So we've actually found the duration hasn't necessarily been longer for remote audits, but we have found that from an external auditor's perspective, a lot more time goes into planning the audit than the actual face-to-face interaction in the audit. Somebody's still got their audio on, so I can't mute. Risks and opportunities, I mentioned before, what are the risks I won't see, everything I need to see, but what are the opportunities that it could actually be a more productive audit for part of it to do it remotely. As I mentioned before, think of the balance in your audit program. So the audit program is the entire audit schedule that you've got and the way that the audits are done. The audit plan is the plan for that particular audit. So look at your audit program, and is this an opportunity to maybe rethink your audit program? How can I actually put in a mix of remote and on-site internal audits that might actually be easier for people to do rather than always expecting people to physically be on site to do those audits? Think about, if you've got a centralised documentation system, it's going to be a lot easier to do a remote audit than if every site or office has its own process. And if it's all manual or paper system, then you may find that it's not easy to do a remote audit that way. We've even had people holding the camera up to paper records so that they can actually have a look at paper records, because we don't, obviously they're not going to scan them all and send them through to us. But if we can't go on site and we need to have a look at records, well, they just point the camera at the paper record and we have a look at it that way. So there's ways around it if you need to do it. You do need to look at the competence of auditors. Just because you're an internal auditor and you may be good at auditing, you may not be comfortable with the use of the different IT involved in doing that. So think about the competence of the auditor being able to do the audit remotely, and are they able to use the different systems that you might have in place, and also the auditee, are they comfortable using it as well? So the confidence between the two of them to actually have that audit done remotely. As I said, the regulatory requirements, there may be some things in health and safety, environmental management that might preclude using remote audits, because you may actually physically have to witness something, and if you can't do that effectively remotely, you may not be able to do that. Same with the information security. You've got to consider what's the risk to information if we're putting records into Dropbox or sending things over email or whatever. So consider any safety risk or information security risk you might have there. We talked about the auditee and their knowledge and comfort with doing it, and also what infrastructure have you got in place. Has everyone got access to Skype? We had one of the remote audits that we were doing it via Zoom with Jazzans, but it also involved a government agency in New Zealand who weren't allowed to access Zoom. So we wasted an hour and a half at the beginning of the audit trying to get this person into our Zoom meeting, but we couldn't, so we had to then go to Skype from a meeting invitation that they sent to us, because they had such strict IT controls in the government agency in New Zealand. So, those sort of things, you need to make sure you work all that out beforehand rather than wasting time during the audit. So planning the audit, as I said, I think a lot more time goes into planning than actually does in the face-to-face part of the audit, and it does require a shift in your thinking to think ahead as to how am I going to get the evidence I need in this audit, and what are the different ways I can use to do that, and maybe having a bit of a chat to the person that you're auditing beforehand to say, look, this is what I need to do. How do you think we can do this? Can you share your screen with me and show me the records, or is that not going to work that way? Don't wait until you get into the internal audit to do that, because that could waste time itself. So spend a bit of time up front planning and even testing the WebEx to make sure you can actually get in there and do it, so that you're not wasting everyone's time. And that might be able to be done a couple of days beforehand, or even talking to them when you know you have to do the audit. Work that out with them, because it may not be the way to do it. You might have to go through sharing files or emails or something like that. You may want to, if you do think about reorganising your internal audit program, you might want to add in there some training for auditors on doing remote audits. More than happy to use these slides if you want to. If you do want to use the slides, I'll put the email address at the end that you can ask for a copy of the slides. But yeah, it might be just something you want to add a little training session for the auditors on how to actually do remote audits versus normal auditing, because there are some things that you have to take into consideration. And if you haven't got a copy of 19,011, which is the guidance document, I'd suggest you have a look at that too. We've also added this sort of stuff into our internal auditing courses. So again, if you're wanting to train up your auditors, we've got the 2-day internal auditing course too that might be worthwhile for any future auditors that you might have. So you need to make sure that everybody can access the ICT, so that's the information communication technology that you are using. Make sure you don't have to have certain licenses. That's one thing that we found, that we thought, oh yeah, we'll all use WebEx, and then we found out that only a few of our staff have access to our WebEx license, and we had to look at how we were doing it across BSI globally, because that was going to be quite a number of licenses that people had to have. So we were looking at other options for that. So make sure you haven't got any sort of restrictions internally as to how many people can use your WebEx license or Zoom license or whatever it might be as well. Work out whether the people at the other end have got the infrastructure and the equipment to be able to do it. Have you got the same apps on your phone that you can share, you know, with Google Hangouts or FaceTime or whatever it might be. Make sure everyone's all working off the same software. And as I mentioned, think of any security issues, and are you going to do it as a full remote audit, or are you going to maybe split it and do a bit of on-site and a bit remote as well? So this sort of stuff really needs to be considered well before you even start the audit, because that's going to make a massive difference to the way the audit actually runs. So a bit more time in planning, maybe less time face-to-face in the audit is required, because you'll do a lot of stuff up front. We've even, in part of our JASANS audits that we've had, we've sent a lot of documentation to the auditor beforehand. So we've sent them procedures and information about how we manage a particular process, so that they've already read that beforehand, and that all counts as part of the auditing time. And then they've come into the audit fired with questions and things that they want to check, and then they'll look at records to see whether we've actually implemented those processes with you know, our various clients. So sometimes it's helpful to be sent stuff beforehand, have a read through those procedures so you've got a good idea of what it is that's meant to be happening, and then you can actually have a look at the implementation of that as part of the audit. Even if they can send you some records beforehand, that can be quite useful as well, and you can then ask them some questions afterwards. So think about the planning and how will it make the audit work more effectively if you've got a little bit more time up front to get that information. Now, 19,011 has all sorts of requirements in there as to what you need to have in your audit plan. And your audit plan is, you know, what are you doing on for the time of the audit? And it depends. If you're doing a 2-hour audit, internal audit, your plan might just be an email saying, hey, Fred, I'm turning up at 9 o'clock, and we'll go through the process, and it'll just be there for 2 hours. That's very different to what we would send to you as a 3-day audit over multiple sites, where you've got multiple people we're talking to, and you break down the audit 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and so on. So it really depends on the size of the audit as to what the audit plan is going to look like. And most internal audits, if they're only small sort of 1-2 hour audits, you're not going to have a detailed plan. But if you are doing a full day audit, then yes, you should have a detailed plan so that the auditee or auditees know when they are going to need to be available and how long that part of the audit is going to go for. So what 19,011 suggests is that if you are preparing a detailed audit plan, these are the things that you should have in your audit plan. Obviously the scope, outline what it is you're actually going to be auditing, and the fact that this bit is being done remotely. And particularly if you're only doing part of it remotely, you would state in your plan, this bit's being done remotely, and then this bit we will be auditing on site on whatever date it might be. You should include in your plan then that what techniques you're actually using, whether you're using a WebEx or you're sharing screens on Skype or whatever it might be. So state in the plan how you're actually performing that part of the audit so that they're aware of that, and where you will be when you're doing the audit. So are you doing it from home, or are you doing it from an interstate office, whatever it might be. How long the remote part of the audit is going to be, and any particular security information. There might be passwords, meeting links, those sorts of things of how they get into the actual meeting. That sort of stuff should all be in the plan. So if you're doing a detailed internal audit, that's really what you should be having in the plan. That's the best practice with that. Certainly any audit plans that we send to clients will have that level of detail. Internal audits, it's only guidance for that. You don't have to, but it's good practice to do that. So when you're actually conducting the audit, as I mentioned before, do a bit of a test the day before. Chances are it might work the day before and it doesn't work on the day of the audit. That happens too. But just make sure that everything works, that you know, sorry to pick on you, Mitchell, but I know I had the same problem with my computer, that if you're using the computer audio and you have another screen plugged in, sometimes the sound doesn't come through and you have to actually use your phone to dial into the WebEx. So that's a very common problem, and you don't want people to waste time during the audit trying to figure that out and get the audio working. So do a trial, make sure it works, make sure they understand what they have to do at their end and that they're comfortable with the system that you're actually using. Make sure that they've got the plan and they know how it's all going to work. And if they need to have certain documentation available, when you send them the plan, that's a good time to say, these are the things that I'll need to be looking for. If you can have this sort of information available, that would be great. That just makes a huge difference to the way in which you run the audit if you've given them that heads up. Doesn't mean it gives them time to go and change all the records. If there's going to be problems, you'll find the problems. It just makes the audit run far more smoothly if they're able to have all that stuff ready for you and they don't have to go searching and you're sitting there with sort of dead air waiting for them to find documentation as well. So give them a bit of a list of what they need to get ready beforehand, or maybe what they can send to you beforehand so you can spend a bit of time reading through that and preparing. If you need to observe activities, then definitely work out how you're going to do that, and that needs to be, worked out up front. Are you able to take a phone around on the site and get them to point the camera at different things for you to see? We've had concrete plants where we've had people holding up phones showing the process, batching and all sorts of things that were happening on site. It can be done. It all comes down to what's the practicality of it and have you got people on site that can actually do what they need to do for you. And then obviously after you've conducted the audit, you need to go through and review all the findings. That's still part of the audit. So keep in mind, break up the audit a bit, have some time face-to-face. But then when you need to have a look at records or documentation, if you can look at them outside the human interaction part of it, that's actually better, because you can then look at it at your own pace. You don't have somebody sitting there at the other end in dead silence while you're trying to look through records. If you can have a way that you can actually view the records without them having to sit there and wait for you to read stuff, that's a good way of doing it too, but not always possible. But I would suggest if you are to, give them the opportunity to explain the records in front of you as well. So just some additional other tips to think of as well, and some of these are fairly obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't really think of this stuff. Have a quiet room if you can. The problem with us all working from home at the moment, it can be tricky to find a quiet room. Thankfully, kids have gone back to school, so we don't have people necessarily coming in and disturbing us, or we don't have to be homeschooling as well. But it's the same as if you're in the office too. If you are doing a remote audit, if you can get into a meeting room or something, particularly if you've got an open plan type office, it's much better if you can go into a quiet room, book that room so that you're free of distractions and noise in the background so that you can run the audit more professionally. It's a good idea to have both a webcam and audio, even though I haven't got the webcam on now. But I think depending on whether people can support both video and audio, it depends on what their internet speed is like. But I think if you're doing an audit one-on-one with someone, it's just so much more personable to have the person on the other side that you can actually see them. And I think, as I mentioned before, people are nervous during audits anyway. So if you can have that face-to-face, it is a little bit more engaging. It shows that it is a human on the other side going through the audit process. It just makes a big difference to do that. I've mentioned testing your system to make sure it works. Stick to the plan. So again, you may find that things don't go to plan as well as you'd hoped, but try and be flexible and adapt your plan to suit things that might happen during the audit itself. I do recommend that you take regular breaks, particularly the fact that it's very different doing it face-to-face. It's very intense. You don't have that physical break where you can sort of look around, have a cup of tea and that sort of stuff. So if you are doing multiple hours of an internal audit, I would suggest you don't do more than an hour at a time. Have a 15-minute break, go away, come back. Just allow a bit of that break for the auditee as well so that they're not having to sit in front of the computer the whole time. It's not good for us all sitting in front of computers all day. But if you do take that break, as I mentioned down here, a little pointer down here, make sure you do shut your camera off, put it on mute, or if you go out of the meeting, then go back in again. But depending on what's in the background of your home or your office, it's a good idea just to turn the camera off just to keep it professional as well. Certainly turn off your email or close any other screens that you might have. There's nothing more embarrassing than an email popping up on your screen with something that that person shouldn't see. And it does happen. It's happened many times in meetings that we've all done. So just make sure you're closing any background programs that you might have on that people really don't want you to see as well. So close the emails. Make sure that people can't see. Think about your background. A lot of the programs, I know Teams, you can blur your background, and some of them now you can even do really fancy backgrounds, like you've got this, New York style office, rather than people seeing your messy bookcase behind you, or the kids running around in the background, or your unmade bed in the background. Yeah, again, keep it professional, but think about what the background looks like. And if you can blur your background or change it, then I think that looks a bit better as well. Obviously, wear appropriate clothing. I must say in the last 3 months, I've been enjoying wearing my tracksuit pants and fluffy slippers every day at work. But I also always have a very nice top on and earrings, but nobody can see the tracksuit pants at the bottom. Obviously, if it's only from the top up, make sure that it's looking professional and it's still appropriate for whatever environment you're doing the work for. And it depends. Everyone's going to have different work environment as well. If you're looking at various records and so on, and you don't have the ability to do that offline, that you have to be on the call with them because they're sharing their screen, rather than having that dead silence, just to mention, just talk out loud, say, okay, so I'm just going through here, looking at this, I can see this is here and that, and talk out loud with what you're looking at, because there's nothing worse than absolute silence while they're looking through things and they're sitting there wondering what you're thinking. It's the same as any even face-to-face audit. I would never go through looking at somebody's records and not say anything for 5–10 minutes while they're looking at me. I always try and keep the conversation going and let them know, what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing, and asking them questions as I'm going through, because it can be quite nerve-wracking for an auditee to just have dead silence as you're looking through things. And careful of facial expressions, because it's just your face on the screen. They're going to see facial expressions even more so in a remote audit than what they would in on-site audit as well. The tricky thing certainly about remote audits is that you probably don't have the control over random sampling that you would necessarily have in an on-site audit, where you can say, okay, I want to look at that record, I want to look at that record. So you may have a risk there that perhaps they will show you the record that they want you to see rather than the one that you might select. Depends. If you've got options up on the screen of things and you can say, okay, the second one from the bottom, let's open that one, that's good because it can be more random, but there is a risk that they're going to select the samples more so in a remote audit. So you have to take that into account, that is one of the risks of doing an audit remotely with records, that you may not have the ability to select those samples. And so keep in mind that it is new for them too. So they will be a bit nervous as they go through the audit process. So keep that in mind. Last slide on there is about the report. So you will have a template for your audit report, and you should follow that same template. But one thing you should add into your audit report is the fact that you have done this audit remotely, and these are the techniques that you've used, because that's a record of what you've done, and it does need to identify that you weren't on site, that you did achieve or collect this information remotely, and that there are challenges associated with that, and you need to at least record that it hasn't been done through normal on-site activities. And that it just provides a record to say that this audit has been done differently, and maybe it's a chance that for the next time we do an audit of this process, we will go on site because the last one was done remotely. But if you don't put it in the audit report, you won't have a record that that was done remotely. So it's just making sure that your audit report records all the conditions of the actual audit itself. So it was done remotely, you were located at place X, the auditee was located at place Y. You use this particular technique of sharing screens with WebEx or telephone or FaceTime, whatever it might be, and these are the activities that were audited remotely, so that it's a good record of what was done. And if there were any challenges, to say that certain things couldn't be looked at because we weren't able to see it remotely, or that the WebEx didn't work, or we lost time, whatever it might be. Record all of that in the report as well. The report is not just where you put the findings, it is meant to tell a story of how the audit was actually run as well. So make sure you put that in there as a record as well. And it might be the person who's managing the internal audit program might want to record on the audit schedule which ones were done remotely and which ones were done on site as well, because that's a good visual for you to see what percentage of your audits are done remotely rather than having to go back and look at all the individual reports as well. So keep that sort of thing in mind. It's meant to be a record of how that audit was actually conducted. Okay, so that's the information that I've got there in terms of how the audits have been, what you need to think of to do them remotely. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy for you to type those into the chat, or if you want to click on the little hand button, I can unmute you to ask a question. So Alina, you've got the, can we have a copy of this webinar audio and slides, please? A lot of useful information, hands-on, has been provided in the audio, which can be used. Yes, we did record this one, so which is great. The last one, we had troubles recording because I couldn't do it from my end, but we have recorded this one, so yes, you will be able to get a recording of that. I'll type into the chat box here the email. The SI group. Okay, so this is the email. If you want to email that address and you can ask for a copy of the recording, it will be a link that you'll be able to go in and get access to that. More than happy for you to have that, and if you wanted to use that for your own internal training purposes, more than happy to do that. If you're looking at training up auditors, then as I said, we do have a 2-day auditor, lead auditor course that would cover remote as well as on-site auditing. That is available as well, and we are doing our courses remotely as well using this technique, but also planning to bring the training back on site soon as well, which will be good. Any other questions? I can't see anyone with their hand up. And no one typing anything in. Okay. If you don't have any questions, thank you for attending. Appreciate your patronage and supporting BSI here. Hopefully we've given you some ideas on how you can manage your internal audit program, and also how you can maybe look at rejigging it down the track as to make your audit program work better for you. On-site auditing is always going to be around, and it's very important to do that, but I don't think there's a problem with mixing that up with some remote auditing as well where it's appropriate. So I think that gives you an opportunity to rethink your audit program as well. And hopefully if you've got an audit coming up in the next 6 months from your certification body, that you might be able to make sure that you've got everything in place and showing that your internal audits are still operating under these COVID conditions. So thank you for your time and have a good day.